How many times have you heard somebody in front of a room say, hey, there's no such thing as a stupid question? Of course there is. What they're trying to get people to realize is they want to welcome questions from the audience, and that's a great thing. I encourage people to ask questions in any presentation I do, and I want them to ask a question if something isn't clear, particularly in a workshop format. From a keynote perspective, when I'm speaking in front of an audience of 2,000 people, questions may not be the easiest, and there's special ways to handle that. But I'm talking about in general meetings. How do you handle questions when you're doing a workshop or a presentation where that's appropriate? The way that you really need to do it is you need to make people understand that you want the questions, but when you say there's no such thing as a stupid question, you're making a statement that your audience knows isn't true. In fact, you see, the problem, once again, is the most difficult thing that most presenters have, and that is you're not thinking from the perspective of the audience member. You're thinking of yourself as the presenter. There's nothing they could ask that you would consider to be a stupid question. But the reality is, to people in the audience, there are questions they'd ask that might make them feel embarrassed. I can remember when I was in high school, I played football, and I didn't know anything about football. In fact, when we were in junior high, you filled out a little card that said, hey, what would you like to do in high school? And they had different things, and football was one of the things. I checked it off. I thought they meant like football at lunch. You know, during lunch, you go and play maybe a little football out in the field or something. I had no idea, but I get a little postcard in the mail, and the postcard said on it, show up to the high school the week before school, and show up at the gym at such and such a time, like 8 in the morning, for practice. And so I took that and I went, oh, okay. And I get there and I show up, and son of a gun, this is the week before school, the training for the team for the high school. The team that every week, every Friday they play with everybody watching and everything else. And I don't know squat about football, but I say, okay, well, this might be fun. So they take us in the locker room, and we're all lined up on the bench, and they're going along giving equipment to each of the guys. And so they ask each person, what position are you going to play? I didn't know what the positions were. And I turned to the guy next to me and I said, what position are you going to be? He was about the same build as me, and he said, center. I said, okay. Of course, that's the guy that hikes the ball. I didn't know that name. I would have said, well, I'll be the guy that hikes the ball. I would have really looked silly. But I didn't know anything. I played along and I said, okay, great, I'll play center. So they asked me, what are you going to be? I said, center. They gave me the gear. Partway into the week, I was studying everything I could. We're learning the plays, and I was totally confused. There's X's and O's and lines on the chart, and I had no idea what was. And so after the practice one day, I went to the coach's office. And I walked in the office, and I closed the door, and I said, Coach, I got a question. He said, what? I said, I really want to learn this. I think it'll be a lot of fun, and I've got the physical ability for it, but I have no idea what's going on. I need you to explain what the X's and O's and everything else are. He thought I was kidding. He thought I was coming in to make a joke about that I didn't really know it. And then he realized I wasn't kidding. I didn't know what it meant. You see, that's an example of what would have been a stupid question from the audience member's perspective. I couldn't, in the team room, when they're writing these things down on the board and showing the plays and where the people go, there's no way I could have raised my hand and said, hey, Coach, excuse me, but what are the X's and O's? The rest of the room, everybody would have laughed at me. They would have made fun of me, and I probably wouldn't have shown up the next day. So I couldn't ask that question. And it's the same for people in your audience. You have people in your audience that there's questions they're not going to ask because they'll feel embarrassed. Maybe it'll make them look like they're the new guy in the place, the newest lady here, the newest guy here, and they don't know enough to know not to ask that question. They might bring something up that would make somebody else look foolish, so they're too nervous to even ask. And you miss out on helping people and clarifying things when you do that. So a great way to handle that is this. Before your presentation, before your workshop, hand out to people little 4x6 cards, or little pieces of paper or notepads, however you want to handle it, but make sure they have something they can write on and tear off or turn in. And you tell people at the beginning of the session, hey, if you have any questions, I want to make sure they get answered. Feel free to raise your hand during the presentation if you'd like. But if you'd rather not raise your hand and bring up a question that way, go ahead and write the question down on the piece of paper. And then turn that in to somebody on our team or to me during the break, and I'll make sure it gets answered. Now, I almost made the mistake a lot of speakers did when I was explaining that. I almost used the word interrupt. I can't tell you how many times I've heard speakers say, hey, don't worry, feel free to interrupt with a question anytime you need to. The problem with that is there's a subliminal message that a lot of people don't understand, and they should. They should know better, and they don't. And that is, interrupting is never a good thing. When they interrupt your TV program for something on the news, it's never anything good. It's usually something drastic has happened, right? Something's blown up, something evil has happened. When your mom taught you what? Don't interrupt people. That was something, don't interrupt, don't interrupt. And so interrupting is a negative word in that context. So I tell people, I want to make sure everybody leaves here with what they want to know. If you have a question, feel free to ask it anytime you'd like, or if you're uncomfortable asking in front of the group, please take a moment and write it down and give it to me during the break, and I'll make sure it gets covered in the appropriate time. By the way, some questions that people give me are personal to them. They don't pertain to the whole group, and that's another thing to keep in mind. Sometimes you'll get a question from somebody that has their own personal agenda. The question has something behind it because they want to do a particular thing. And you need to have enough sense at that moment to say, hey, I understand that that's a good question, but it pertains pretty much to you and your department, so I'd like to meet with you after the meeting to go over the answer to that so we don't take up everybody else's time. That's a good way to cover for that and then separate that out. Another challenge in meetings in general is that person that wants to kind of hog the whole event. They want everything to be about them. I was at a training at the National Speakers Association in Phoenix, Arizona, and when I was there, one of the people kept interrupting the speaker and saying, oh yes, I use that in my business, and I do this, and I do that, and they were bragging about what they did, and they were talking about their business all the time and everything else. And so during the break, the organizer of the event talked to the person in the hallway and said, hey, can you do me a favor? We're videotaping this presentation, and the questions interfere with the timing on the video and everything. So if you could save those to the end, and then maybe Randy will answer them afterwards when it's more convenient in that situation. I talked to the organizer because I heard that conversation, and I asked him later, I said, by the way, were you actually trying to get the guy to straighten out for the video, or was that an excuse to get him to shut up? And he smiled at me because it was an excuse to get the guy not to monopolize the meeting. One of my trainers that I learned hypnosis from had a technique he used that was brilliant. He knew that in the 9-day course that we were taking, that over the course of the 9 days, that virtually every question somebody was going to ask is going to get answered. But he didn't want people feeling uncomfortable that something might be left out. At the same time, though, if somebody asked a question on day 1 that's going to be answered on day 3, and he knows that it's in the course content, then letting them ask a question at that moment, and then he'd have to say, well, I'll answer that on Wednesday or whatever. Instead, he did this technique. He said all questions have to be written down. If you have a question, write it down, turn it into the staff, and they did, and then they would go through them, and if it was something that was going to be handled during the week, they'd let the person know. They'd say, by the way, that's a great question. It's going to be covered on Wednesday. And then that way they had the comfort of knowing their question was going to be answered. And if it was something unique, if it wasn't something that was going to be covered, then they could either cover it in the class if it pertained to everybody, or they could do it privately. Occasionally you'll get a private question from somebody, and I always ask them personally, is it okay with you if I share the answer with the entire group? Because I think that would help other people. And sometimes the answer to that is no, because if I bring up the situation and I say, hey, somebody had a problem with a forklift doing this, that, or another thing, everybody's going to know who the forklift person is. So it's not anonymous anymore. So you have to respect that with people, and you'll get a lot more questions from people when you treat them fairly like that. The other thing is, remember always to think in terms of the perspective of the audience. What is important to them? What do they need to know? And answer the question based upon their perspective, not necessarily yours. And that's how you can do a great job making sure that people's questions get answered. Don't miss out. Be sure to hit the red button on the lower right and subscribe. That way, every time we release a video, you'll be aware of it.